What if the most profound economic story of the last half-century had never been written? Imagine for a moment, a world where the skyline of Shanghai remained low and muted, where hundreds of millions of people never escaped the grip of rural poverty, and where the phrase, "Made in China," just wasn't a ubiquitous label on nearly every product we own. This isn't some far-fetched fantasy, it's actually a very real alternative history, a path that was nearly taken. The China we know today, a global powerhouse, a technological innovator, a linchpin of the world economy, exists because of a series of deliberate and, at the time, highly risky decisions. To really understand the 21st century, we first have to appreciate the magnitude of that choice and, honestly, contemplate the vastly different world we would inhabit if things had gone the other way. The rise of China was not preordained. It wasn't some inevitable consequence of its size or its history. For decades after the Communist Revolution, China was isolated, impoverished, and deeply dogmatic, torn apart by ideological campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. These weren't policies designed for global integration, they were designed for internal purity and control. The country was intentionally sealed off from the international currents of trade, technology, and ideas that were lifting other nations in Asia, like Japan and South Korea, to new heights of prosperity. The decision to reverse this course was a seismic event, a pivot so dramatic that its aftershocks are still shaping our reality today. Contemplating this alternate path is more than just an academic exercise. It forces us to recognize how contingent history truly is. The globalized world we take for granted, a world of intricate supply chains, affordable consumer goods, and rapid technological diffusion, was built on the foundation of China's opening. Without that single pivotal event, the entire architecture of the modern global economy would be, well, completely different. The forces of globalization would have been weaker, the geography of manufacturing would have been redrawn, and the balance of global power would look nothing like it does today. We'd be living in a world that was not only less prosperous, but also fundamentally less interconnected and dynamic. This journey into a counterfactual past really reveals the profound impact of a single nation's choices on the entire global system. It highlights how the decisions made in Beijing in the late 1970s rippled outward, touching lives in small towns in America, factory floors in Germany, and tech startups in Silicon Valley. The story of what didn't happen is, in many ways, as illuminating as the story of what did. It lets us see with fresh eyes the incredible transformation that took place and helps us appreciate the intricate web of dependencies that now binds our world together. The absence of China's rise would have left a vacuum so immense that it would have altered the very texture of modern life. The story of China's modern ascent really begins with one man, Deng Xiaoping. After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976 and the end of the tumultuous Cultural Revolution, Deng emerged as China's paramount leader. He was a pragmatist who had witnessed the devastation wrought by decades of rigid ideology. He famously declared, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." This simple aphorism signaled a monumental shift. For Deng, the goal was not ideological purity but practical results, namely, economic development and the improvement of his people's lives. In December 1978, he launched the policy of reform and opening up, a decision that would change the course of world history. The process wasn't a sudden dramatic opening but a careful, gradual experiment. Deng's approach was to cross the river by feeling the stones. The first and most iconic of these stones were the special economic zones. In 1980, 4 coastal cities, including Shenzhen, then just a small fishing village, were designated as laboratories for market capitalism. These zones offered tax incentives, streamlined regulations, and modern infrastructure to attract foreign investment. They became magnets for capital from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and later, the West. For the first time since the revolution, foreign businesses were allowed to operate on Chinese soil, bringing with them not just money but technology, management skills, and a direct connection to global markets. This initial success emboldened China's reformers. The model of the special economic zones was gradually expanded to other coastal cities and then inland. The country systematically dismantled its centrally planned economy, allowing for private enterprise, decollectivizing agriculture, and letting market forces determine prices. This was a long and often difficult process, but the results were staggering. Foreign direct investment flooded in, transforming China into the world's factory. The ultimate step in this integration came in 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization. This was the point of no return. It locked China into the global trading system, forcing it to abide by international rules while granting it unprecedented access to global markets. The economic impact was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Between 1978 and today, China's GDP has grown by an average of nearly 10% per year. It has lifted more than 800 million of its citizens out of extreme poverty, the single greatest poverty reduction in human history. This was not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it was a tangible transformation that reshaped every aspect of Chinese society and, in turn, the world. Deng's gamble had paid off on a scale that even he likely never imagined. He had taken a broken, isolated country and set it on a path to become a global economic superpower. Now let's imagine a different path. What if Mao's ideological successors, not Deng's pragmatists, had won the power struggle in the late 1970s? In this alternate timeline, China remains a closed society, a vast hermit kingdom, suspicious of the outside world and committed to the principles of self-reliance and central planning. The reform and opening up policy is never implemented. The Iron Curtain that separates China from the global economy remains firmly in place. The country turns inward, doubling down on the very policies that had led to stagnation and suffering for the preceding 3 decades. This is a China frozen in time, a relic of the Cold War era. In this world, the economic boom never happens. The coastal cities of Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen do not become glittering metropolises humming with commerce. Instead, they remain quiet, state-controlled ports with decaying infrastructure, their potential suffocated by bureaucracy. The countryside remains trapped in the grip of collectivized agriculture, with hundreds of millions of peasants struggling to subsist on meager rations, their productivity crippled by the absence of private incentives. Poverty is not an issue to be solved, but an accepted, endemic feature of life for the vast majority of the population. The state-owned enterprises continue to churn out low-quality goods for a captive domestic market, inefficient and uncompetitive. The lack of foreign investment means a profound lack of development. Without access to Western, Japanese, and Korean capital and technology, China's industrial base remains primitive. It misses the manufacturing revolution entirely. The factories that would have produced everything from toys and textiles to iPhones and laptops are never built. The country's vast labor force, one of its greatest potential assets, remains underutilized and trapped in low-productivity agricultural work. The missed opportunities are staggering. China would not become the world's factory, it would remain a silent giant, its economic potential locked away and unrealized. Technology, the engine of modern growth, would also bypass this isolated China. The internet might arrive, but it would be a heavily restricted, state-controlled intranet, more like North Korea's Kwangmyong than the global web. There would be no flood of Chinese students heading to Western universities and so, no reverse brain drain of scientists and engineers returning home to found new companies. Innovation would be stifled by a lack of competition, a scarcity of capital, and an ideological climate hostile to the free exchange of ideas. China would be a technological backwater, unable to create its own digital ecosystem or participate in the global tech race. The absence of an open China would have radically reshaped the global economy. The most immediate and noticeable effect would be on manufacturing and the price of goods. For the past 4 decades, China's entry into the global market acted as a massive deflationary force. Its vast, low-cost labor pool made it possible to produce consumer goods from clothing and electronics to furniture and toys at a fraction of their previous cost. This China price became the global benchmark, lowering inflation and raising the real incomes of consumers across the developed world. A trip to Walmart or Target would be a very different and much more expensive experience. Without China as the world's factory, where would manufacturing have gone? Some production would have certainly remained in the United States and Europe for longer, preserving certain industrial jobs, but also keeping prices high for consumers. More likely, the manufacturing boom would have been distributed more broadly, but less intensely, across other developing nations. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia would have seen more investment and industrialization. However, none of these nations possessed the unique combination of scale, labor supply, government direction, and infrastructure investment that allowed China to become such a dominant force. The result would have been a more fragmented, less efficient, and costlier global supply chain. The very nature of global supply chains would be different. The intricate, just-in-time logistics systems that define modern commerce were built around the central hub of China. Companies designed their entire production processes around sourcing components and assembling final products there. Without this central node, supply chains would be shorter, more regional, and less complex. This might have made them more resilient in some ways, but it would have also made them far less efficient, sacrificing the massive economies of scale that China enabled. The hyper-globalization of the 1990s and 2000s, which was predicated on China's integration, would have been a much more muted affair. This alternate economic landscape would have had profound consequences for global growth. The China shock was not just about cheap goods, it was also about China becoming a massive consumer and investor in its own right. Its insatiable demand for raw materials, oil from the Middle East, iron ore from Australia, soybeans from Brazil, fueled a global commodities boom that lifted economies around the world. As an investor, China's state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds poured capital into infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Without China's economic engine, global GDP growth over the past few decades would have been significantly slower, and the economic fortunes of many resource-exporting nations would have been far dimmer. The technological landscape of the 21st century has been profoundly shaped by China's rise. In a world where China had remained closed, the digital universe we inhabit would feel strangely empty. An entire ecosystem of globally recognized technology companies would simply not exist. There would be no Alibaba to challenge Amazon in e-commerce, no Tencent with its ubiquitous WeChat app, and no Baidu dominating the search market for over 1 billion people. The global tech industry would be far more monopolistic, with American giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta, formerly Facebook, facing even less international competition than they do today. The hardware side of the tech world would be equally transformed. Huawei, a company that grew from a small reseller into a global leader in telecommunications and smartphones, would be an unknown entity. The fierce competition it provided in the 5G network space, which drove down prices and accelerated innovation, would be absent. Smartphone brands like Xiaomi, Oppo, and Vivo, which collectively command a massive share of the global market, would never have been founded. Consumers would have fewer choices and likely pay higher prices, with companies like Apple and Samsung enjoying an even more entrenched duopoly. Perhaps the most visible absence would be TikTok. The short-form video app became a global cultural phenomenon, reshaping social media, music, and online trends. Its powerful recommendation algorithm represented a genuine innovation that challenged Silicon Valley platforms. In a closed China scenario, this cultural force would never have been unleashed. The digital world would be less diverse, with trends dictated almost exclusively from the West Coast of the United States. Beyond specific companies, China's role as the world's technology assembler would be gone. The city of Shenzhen, the electronics capital of the world, would not exist in its current form. The complex supply chain that allows Apple to design in California and mass-produce in China would have to be re-engineered. Production would be scattered across Vietnam, Mexico, and India, but the Chinese manufacturing ecosystem would be impossible to replicate. New gadgets would take longer to develop, be more expensive, and reach the market in smaller quantities. The geopolitical consequences of a closed and underdeveloped China would be just as profound as the economic ones. The defining feature of international relations in the early 21st century has been the rise of China and the resulting competition with the United States. This dynamic, often described as a new Cold War, has shaped military strategies, diplomatic alliances, and global debates on everything from trade to human rights. Without a powerful, economically vibrant China, this central organizing principle of world affairs would vanish. The world would not be bipolar, but starkly unipolar. In this reality, the United States would have emerged from the Cold War, not just as the sole superpower, but as an utterly unrivaled and unchallenged hegemon. There would be no peer competitor on the horizon to check American power or offer an alternative model of governance and development. The end of history thesis, which proclaimed the final triumph of liberal democracy, might have seemed far more plausible and enduring. American military, economic, and cultural dominance would be absolute. This could have led to a more stable world, but it could also have led to a more complacent and overreaching America, less constrained by the need to compete. The strategic map of Asia would be completely redrawn. Nations like Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India would not be balancing their relationships between Washington and a powerful Beijing. Instead, their foreign policies would be almost entirely oriented toward the United States. Alliances in the region would be simpler and more rigid. China, in this scenario, would be viewed not as a strategic rival or partner, but as a source of instability, a larger, more volatile version of North Korea. The focus of its neighbors would be on containing its potential for internal collapse or unpredictable lashing out, rather than managing its rise. Furthermore, China's diplomatic and economic influence in the developing world would be non-existent. The Belt and Road Initiative, a colossal global infrastructure project designed to connect Asia, Africa, and Europe, would never have been conceived. African and Latin American nations would not be turning to Beijing for loans, infrastructure development, and political support. Instead, they would be reliant solely on Western-led institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, which often come with different conditions and priorities. The Global South would have fewer options and less agency in its dealings with the great powers. What would have become of China itself? A nation of over 1 billion people, denied the economic release valve of global trade, would have been a cauldron of immense internal pressure. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy since the 1980s has rested on a simple, unspoken bargain with its people: we will deliver prosperity and national pride, and in return, you will accept our one-party rule. Without the economic miracle, the party would be unable to hold up its end of the deal. The social contract would be broken, leading to a crisis of legitimacy that could have played out in several dramatic ways. One possible future is the North Korean model. To maintain its grip on power in the face of economic failure, the regime could have become even more repressive, totalitarian, and militaristic. It would rely on a pervasive security apparatus, intense ideological indoctrination, and a manufactured cult of personality around its leader. The country would be sealed off from the world, not just economically but informationally and culturally as well. This giant North Korea, with a population more than 50 times larger and armed with nuclear weapons, would be a terrifyingly unpredictable and destabilizing presence in the heart of Asia, prone to famine and internal purges. Another, perhaps more likely scenario is fragmentation and collapse. Widespread poverty, coupled with rising expectations fueled by glimpses of the outside world, could create the perfect conditions for a popular revolution. The Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, which were crushed in our timeline, might have been just the beginning. Without the promise of a better economic future to placate the masses, dissent could have simmered and then exploded. Such a revolution in a country the size of China would not be a simple regime change. It could lead to a period of protracted civil war and chaos, similar to the warlord era of the early 20th century, with devastating humanitarian consequences. A third possibility lies somewhere in between: a slow, grinding decay. The central government in Beijing might lose its authority, with regional leaders and military commanders gaining de facto autonomy. The country would not formally break apart, but it would cease to function as a unitary state. Corruption would be rampant, infrastructure would crumble, and black markets would flourish as the official economy seized up. This failed state scenario would create a massive power vacuum in Asia, and could trigger enormous refugee crises as millions sought to escape the poverty and instability. In any of these scenarios, the internal fate of China would be grim, a stark contrast to the national rejuvenation it experienced in our reality. Reflecting on the path not taken forces us to a stark conclusion. The decision by China's leaders to open their economy was one of the single most consequential events of the 20th century, and it fundamentally defined the world of the 21st. The alternative, a closed, stagnant, and unstable China, would have given us a poorer, less dynamic, and vastly different global landscape. The prosperity that many in the West have taken for granted, fueled by low-cost goods and low inflation, was a direct dividend of China's integration into the world economy. The rise of the Global South, powered in part by China's demand for commodities, would have been a much slower story. The story of China's opening is a powerful lesson in the benefits of economic interconnectedness. It demonstrated, on a scale never before witnessed, the power of trade, investment, and the exchange of ideas to lift hundreds of millions of people from poverty and unleash human potential. It showed that even a communist state, by embracing certain elements of the market, could achieve spectacular results. This is not to ignore the complex and often troubling aspects of China's rise, its authoritarian politics, its human rights record, and the disruptive challenges it now poses to the international order. But it is to recognize the sheer magnitude of the transformation. The world we live in today is one defined by the complexities of this success. We grapple with how to manage supply chain dependencies on China, how to compete with its technological giants, and how to navigate a geopolitical landscape shaped by its power. These are the problems of a world with a strong, integrated China. They are difficult problems to be sure, but they are profoundly different from the problems we would have faced in the alternate reality. How to contain a destitute and volatile failed state, how to manage famines and refugee crises, and how to spur global growth in the absence of its most powerful engine. Ultimately, looking back at the world that might have been gives us a clearer perspective on the world that is. It reminds us that history is not a deterministic march, but a series of choices and turning points. The late 20th century was such a turning point, and the path chosen by Deng Xiaoping set our world on its current trajectory. The challenges of the 21st century are many, but they are the challenges of a world shaped by China's unprecedented rise. It is a world of immense opportunity and immense complexity, a world that was, against the odds, made in China.